Welcome to the History Guy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories of lesser-known historical events told by Lance Geiger, also known as the History Guy on YouTube. I'm Josh, your host, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. We tell all kinds of stories about history, from the modern era to the ancient past, so you never know what we're going to talk about next. One thing you can be sure of, it is history that deserves to be remembered. On today's episode, the History Guy tells the story of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, examining the long history to figure out what we know about the two legendary outlaws, and very often, what we don't. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
On February 20th, 1901, three Americans, Mr. and Mrs. Harry A. Place and Mrs. Place's brother, Jim Ryan, boarded a steamship called the SS Herminius, which was bound from New York to Patagonia. That trip would be the genesis of a set of enduring mysteries that would challenge the discipline of history. The man calling himself Jim Ryan was in fact Robert Leroy Parker, and the man calling himself Harry A. Place was in fact Harry Alonzo Longabaugh, and they were two of the most successful and most prolific bank and train robbers in American history. You might better recognize them by their nicknames, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And as much as an enigma as their life was, their companion, Etta Place, was, well, even more of a mystery. The circumstances which caused those famous outlaws to board that steamship were, well, not always as the movies portray. It's history that deserves to be remembered. Robert Leroy Parker was born in Utah in 1866, the son of a Mormon pioneer. He grew up on the family ranch, started working on nearby ranches at the age of 13, helping to support his family. Sometime in the 1880s, he met a ranch hand and petty criminal named Mike Cassidy, from whom he learned about handling horses. He apparently admired his mentor and started going by the last name, Cassidy. He worked as a hired hand, was notably good with horses, and participated in local horse races. He was also quite good-looking. A young admirer, Josie Bassett, described Parker when he was 20 as the most dashing and handsome man that I had ever seen. At the time, Parker was working as a hired hand on a nearby ranch and going under the name George Cassidy. Josie Bassett and her sister Ann would become acquainted with Cassidy and many others at their ranch near Browns Park in the rough area around the Colorado, Utah, Wyoming border. Cassidy would often leave the area for months at a time, but would then return, was admired by the Bassett sisters, both of whom were rumored to have been linked to him romantically. There are two stories for how he came up with the nickname Butch. One claims he got the name while working at a butcher shop in Wyoming one winter. Another story is that the nickname was coined as a rib at Cassidy, who was once knocked over into some mud when he fired a shotgun named Butch that had a notorious kick. The area around the Bassett's ranch was a good spot for people on the run. It was remote. Locations along the border of three states left lawmen with questions of jurisdiction. There were many places to hide, and people like the Bassett's father would sell horses and beef to men without asking too many questions. The area became known as Outlaws Trail, and Cassidy made the acquaintance of several people with whom he would eventually partner in various ventures. It isn't exactly clear when Butch Cassidy turned to a life of crime, but he was most likely involved in a bank robbery in Telluride, Colorado in 1889. After they pulled a job, Cassidy and his associates would often lay low for a while before meeting again at some sort of prearranged point, and Butch Cassidy often spent that time in between near the Bassett's ranch at Browns Point. Josie Bassett used the euphemism, "One of Butch's rich uncles died," to refer to those times when he came back, flush with cash from having pulled a job. In 1894, Cassidy was sent to prison in Laramie, Wyoming, for horse theft, and served 18 months for the crime. He was able to secure early release by promising the governor that he would no longer commit crimes in Wyoming. Sometime after his return from prison, he helped to form a loose group of as many as 25 associates who called themselves the Wild Bunch. The colorful group of robbers included Cassidy's close friend, Elsie Lay, and outlaws like Bill Kilpatrick, known as the Tall Texan, George Flatnose Curry, and his protege, Harry Logan, who adopted the name Kid Curry. Sometime later, Harry Alonzo Longabaugh became a part of the group. Longabaugh was born in Pennsylvania in 1867, and at 15 traveled west to help with his brother's homestead. Longabaugh worked at his brother's ranch in Cortez in southwestern Colorado and may have become acquainted with Cassidy or his associates there, as they sometimes raced horses in the area. In 1886, he set out to make his fortune, working as a ranch hand. In 1887, he fell on hard times, as there was less work for ranch hands after a bad winter had killed many Wyoming cattle. He stole a horse and some goods in Wyoming and was caught by a sheriff outside of Miles City, Montana. It was the only crime for which he was ever successfully held. While being taken to trial, Longabaugh managed a brief escape and made several more attempts. He was adept at getting out of handcuffs and was described in the local newspaper as a slippery cuss. Harry was sentenced to 18 months in the county jail in Sundance, Wyoming. Owing to his young age, not even 21 upon his release, the local newspaper referred to him as Kid Longabaugh, and after that he started going by the name the Sundance Kid. Multiple accounts describe him as good-looking, blonde, charming, and well-behaved. He was an excellent horseman, and despite being fast with a pistol, was not known to have killed anyone. He worked as a cowhand and horsebreaker in Canada, where he was described as a splendid rider and a top-notch cowhand. But life as an honest cowhand did not last long. In 1892, he participated in a train robbery near Malta, Montana. The robbery put the Pinkerton Detective Agency, employed by the railroad, on his trail. The wanted notice described him as 5 feet 11 inches, dark complexion, short dark mustache, dark hair. Longabaugh was suspected by the Pinkertons in a number of robberies, some of which he almost certainly was not involved, but he did apparently participate in a train robbery in Wilcox Station, Wyoming in 1899, in which a large amount of dynamite was used to open the express safe. Butch Cassidy has often been assumed to have been part of the robbery as well, but there's at least some evidence that he could not have been present. It is more likely that he was involved in the planning, but not in the robbery itself, which would have violated the agreement he made when he was released from prison in 1896. Flush with cash, Longabaugh went to lay low in Texas, where he is presumed to have first met a woman named Ethel. Little at all is known about the woman called Etta Place. She went by the name Ethel, but newspaper accounts and Pinkerton reports often used the name Etta, likely because of a misspelling in a Pinkerton memo. The Pinkerton agency assumed that she was from Texas and sought information on her there, but she also claimed to have come from the Northeast. She was described as intelligent and beautiful, with refined speech and manners, but still skilled at riding horses and with a rifle. By various accounts, she was a prostitute, a ranch girl, a school teacher, or a mother who abandoned her children for the handsome outlaw. In 1949, a retired Pinkerton detective speculated that she and Harry had met in a house of ill fame. If so, it would not have been surprising. Members of the Wild Bunch often found women in brothels, and both gang members Kid Curry and Will Carver had married prostitutes. Several possible candidates considered by historians are derived from records regarding women who worked in Fanny Portal's brothel in San Antonio and whose birth dates fit the description. But there's no hard evidence that she was ever a prostitute, and her appearance and manners did not seem to fit the profile of a woman in a profession that tended to take a heavy toll on a woman's health. Her identity and past before 1900, even her name, has never been established. The last name, Place, was Longabaugh's mother's maiden name. In August of 1900, a Union Pacific train was robbed near Tipton, Wyoming, in a robbery similar to the one in 1899, including the use of dynamite on the safe. Many accounts assume that both Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid participated in the robbery, but there's compelling evidence, including a note from Sundance before the robbery and a detailed account provided by him later, that say that the two instead joined another member of the Wild Bunch named Will Carver, who was nicknamed News because it was said to delight in seeing his name in the newspaper, for a bank robbery in Winnemucca, Nevada. Careful planning allowed them to outpace the posse following them. It was a very rich haul. A letter later from Cassidy said that another of my rich uncles died and left $30,000. That would be close to $1 million today. Pinkerton detectives that were trailing them noted that they were exchanging money both from the Winnemucca bank robbery and the Wilcox train robbery, where some of the gold was still blackened from the dynamite. Realizing that the law was on their tail, they apparently decided that it was time to skip the country. In November, they met up with 3 other members of the Wild Bunch: Will Carver, Harvey Kid Curry Logan, and Ben Tall Texan Kilpatrick in Fort Worth, Texas. The 5 decided to have an now-famous photograph called the Fort Worth 5 taken. The photo was a mistake. The shop owner put a copy in his window, where a Pinkerton detective recognized Will Carver. The agency had hundreds of copies made, and they were used to identify the men. When one of them recognized a lawman on the street, the men left town. Time was running out for the Wild Bunch. Will Carver was killed by a sheriff in Sonora, Texas in April 1901. Ben Kilpatrick was captured in St. Louis in 1901 and sentenced to 15 years. For a short while, the police were convinced it was Harry Longabaugh that they had caught. Harvey Logan, who despite not being as well known as Butch and Sundance, was the member of the Wild Bunch known to have killed the most people, was finally caught in 1902 and sentenced to 20 years, but escaped in 1903. His mentor, George Flatnose Curry, had been killed by a sheriff in Utah in 1900. Harry collected Ethel, and the two claimed to marry, although no official record has been found. They visited his family in Pennsylvania and met up with Butch in New York. Harry and Ethel had a photo taken in February, a copy of which he sent to a friend in Wyoming, where it was copied by Pinkerton detectives. They visited a health spa, which was able to provide a description of them to the Pinkertons. Butch bought Harry a watch at Tiffany & Company, possibly as a wedding present. And then, traveling as Mr. and Mrs. Harry Place and Jim Ryan, they set sail for Argentina. There's been quite a lot of historical research on Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, dozens, maybe hundreds of books, but historians disagree, and there's still quite a lot of controversy about their lives. And of course, much of what the public knows comes from what we've seen on television or in film, notably the Oscar-winning 1969 film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid that starred Paul Newman and Robert Redford and Catherine Ross as Etta Place. But things didn't necessarily go the way that they were described in the movies. For example, it's generally assumed that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were best friends, but that might not be the case. It appears that they simply might have been a coincidence that they pulled their last big job together that ended up tying them together for the rest of their lives. Elza Lay was generally considered to be Butch Cassidy's best friend, but he had been arrested the year before in New Mexico and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Still, it's possible that Butch Cassidy and Harry Longabaugh knew each other much earlier than has been suspected, because Longabaugh's family always suspected that he played some role in the 1889 bank robbery that Butch pulled in Telluride, Colorado. There's several crimes that are generally attributed to the two where they might not have been. For example, the Pinkertons assume that they participated, both of them, in the Tipton train robbery and then rushed to Nevada to pull the Winnemucca bank job. But there was only 3 weeks in between. It would have been extremely difficult to travel the 600 miles distance and have adequate time to plan the Winnemucca robbery. The thing is, the Wild Bunch had a very clear strategy. They would pull their robberies during the day, but they would have pre-positioned fresh mounts so that they could quickly outpace posses. It was a very effective strategy, but since all the gang used it, then jobs that were pulled by some members of the gang might be misattributed to other members of the gang. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was a relentless pursuer and also sometimes an unscrupulous one. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid often lamented that they wanted to quit robbing and go straight, only to have their past and the law catch up with them. And nowhere was that more apparent than in the next and most enigmatic phase of their careers in South America. But that is another story.
Now is the part of the episode where we get to chat with the history guy and learn a little more about what we've talked about and some behind-the-scenes stuff that you only get to hear about on the podcast. So this is, I think, the only time in all of the many, many episodes that we've done that you did part one and
Absolutely.
part two.
Yeah, specifically a two-parter, yeah.
Yeah, and so what was your decision making on that?
Well, I mean, it started off, the question was going to be what happened to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, but that really, when I really looked at it, that made it into a story that was longer than one episode. And it's just such a good mystery. It seems totally worth it. So it is very fascinating to hear where they came from. And these are fairly famous outlaws of the Wild West, but exactly their history is really quite interesting, how they got to where they were and how they got the names that they did and how they ended up together. And so I love the first episode. It's really interesting because I had never really known their origin stories. And so it was fun to study the origin stories. But honestly, this one started because we'd had successful episodes on Sarah Marcus Earp and on Big Nose Kate. And so I was trying to look up Etta Place, and that's where this started. And of course, there's not a lot of information on Etta Place, but that led to a two-part on Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Such a great mystery, such a great story, such interesting people. It's worth it.
And it's a story that has become so clouded by legend that it's worth hearing the what we know about it factually. And even when you start
both the
talking
legend
about
of their
that,
life here as bank robbers and the legend of what happened to them afterwards when they headed for Patagonia, they're both just good stories. But it's interesting. The 1969 movie is very famous. It's probably the biggest reason that people know Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And wasn't presented as history.
No.
Didn't do a good job of the history part. And so it is kind of interesting to take these characters that have been so romanticized and to really try to talk about what do we really know about them? Where did they really meet? How did they really end up together? And what were really the crimes that they were committing? And with one of the more interesting bits being that it might be that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid weren't particularly didn't know each other particularly well until circumstance put them on the boat to South America. We don't know for sure, but I mean it might be that they weren't really just close friends; that they just happened to be at the same place at the same time with this last big score in the Nevada bank robbery.
Yeah, certainly they were connected, but it is interesting to think that these are two names that might be, forever attached to one another. And they were
absolutely.
not.
That might not have been how they saw the world at all. I mean, it might have been just coincidence that threw them together for the last years of their lives. Yeah,
because Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I mean, it's to the point where if you say Butch Cassidy, you expect
and the Sundance Kid. Yeah. It's interesting to hear how Sundance got the name Kid.
Yeah,
and it's interesting to find out about him. How Butch Cassidy was much rougher, and Harry Longabaugh seems like he was almost more of a gentlemanly sort.
Yeah, he didn't. He's not known to have shot anyone, which is an interesting. That's an interesting story. There.
It is interesting, yeah, because you might get a different opinion if you saw the movie or if you thought of them as outlaws or something like that. So I mean, they did lead interesting lives. I mean, I think it's funny that he would say that a rich uncle died. He'd come back to Colorado there and say, "Oh, a rich uncle died," and they knew that he had robbed something. And it's, I mean, these were skilled robbers. They were good at their trade. They knew what they were doing. But, also there were quite a lot in the Wild Bunch. And so their legend might be bigger than it is because they might not have been involved in a lot of the robberies that have been attributed to them. We just, because there were so many of them using the method.
It's truly interesting that we're really not sure what crimes can be accurately attributed to them.
Absolutely,
there are a number of them that we're like, oh, they might have been at that crime, but we're not necessarily sure. And their legend had grown even in their own lifetime. That they even the Pinkertons could be like, oh, they committed one crime and then ran across the country,
to get to another crime. Yeah, well, I mean, the Pinkertons weren't completely reliable on their investigations, of course, and there were reasons. I mean, there were reasons that you might want to associate them with crimes, even if you didn't have good evidence that they're associated with crimes, because you're looking for the bounty and you're looking to solve crimes and things like that. But they're also, I mean, a lot of times it would have been almost impossible to tell. I mean, what they would see is that there was a group operating with the same, MO, the same procedure, and then they would guess that probably, Butch had to be there or Harry Longabaugh had to be there. Yeah. We honestly don't know. So even with, and of course they're relatively well tracked because they did attract the attention of the Pinkertons. But even with the information the Pinkertons had, I mean, the Pinkertons never knew who Etta Place was. Never figured out in any way who Etta Place was.
Yeah, if they had, we'd have more information about it today.
Yeah, we'd have a record on it. Clearly they were trying. Clearly they came up with theories. None of those theories are fitting. But I mean, they were, which, the Pinkertons didn't necessarily stay within a lot of themselves. But I mean, they were intercepting mail, U.S. mail, in order to read where they were. So clearly they'd known who Etta Place was, and they would wanted to have known her name so that they could do the same thing, follow her family, see if that could tell someone where it is. So we have a good record of them in some ways, but we don't have a good record of them in some ways. And, and part of it is a question. They might have known each other quite much earlier than we realize. Yeah. Harry Longabow's family thought that he might have been involved in a robbery far earlier than we understand him being involved in crime. But maybe not. Maybe they actually met each other relatively late in life.
It's really hard to tell with the information we have. And of course, we never got any kind of interview with them. And to be honest, I don't know that. I mean, like the Pinkertons would have brought them in alive if they could have. But even from the ones that were brought in alive or who lived longer tales, we don't necessarily have the stories from them that we might like to have to know exactly what went on, or maybe could you trust them? Quite honestly,
well, the Wild Bunch was a wild bunch, and they didn't end up being around to tell all their stories for the most part.
Yeah, most of them ended up dead in one way or another, or disappeared, as it was. I live in Wyoming, and I've lived most of my life in Wyoming at this point. And you grew up in the Black Hills. There's some when you grow up. I mean, I think everybody has heard stories about these Western outlaws and stuff, but you do hear a lot about it when you live out here in the West, and about the hole in the wall and all these places that they were. I mean, this is the area that they were active in, and they're absolutely legends. And you see all kinds of places where they've put up various kinds of memorials, or if you go to Wall Drug, that they've got stuff about the outlaws and the.
Well, both you and I attended the University of Wyoming. It's right there is where the territorial prison was. It's still there.
Yeah,
the prison that Butch Cassidy at the time is still there, and it's preserved. So it's so we grew up on these stories. That's right. But I mean, I think a lot of people are fascinated with the Wild West. I think if you ask, there's only a few names that they might know, and Billy the Kid, Jesse James, and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid.
Yeah.
So I mean, you could ask people, and halfway around the world, and those are the names that they'll likely know. So I mean, it's interesting to present that as forgotten history, like we do on the History Guy. Yeah. But I mean, it was just these are after all that I had seen and done. I didn't really know their whole background story, so I thought it was interesting to put them together. And it starts off by saying they got on the boat, and this first episode is about what took them to the point where they got on the boat. Yeah. And it's important for a few reasons. One being that those are the only verifiable photographs that we have, and the only picture that we know of Etta Place was right before they got on the. They took that picture in New York before they got on the boat. Yeah. And so it's we know where they were at one specific point in time. We know exactly where they were and exactly how they got on the boat and exactly what names they were using. And there's still a lot of question mark before that, and there's a lot of question mark after that. So we start at that point, that pinpoint where we knew what they were doing and why. And then we got to go see, what else do we know going both, before that and after.
Yeah. One of the amazing things about this story is it is in a lot of ways the death of the frontier. And we see where these where, you were able to be an outlaw, and that was a reasonable way of life, honestly.
It was. Well, it's always interesting to find out, like, Bat Masterson ended up being a baseball reporter. And Wyatt Earp lived long enough to coach, people in film on who Wyatt Earp was. So, I mean, these guys, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, there's at least significant evidence to suggest that they came home from South America to visit the 1904 World Exposition at the St. Louis World Fair.
That's crazy.
So we really are crossing over, the time you would think that we were kind of past the time of the train robbers and stuff like that, but they really do overlap in interesting ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and this was that crossing point, and that's part of why these guys were so famous, is that as civilization was encroaching, they were, honestly kind of spitting in the face of it.
They were. It attracted attention because people still they could remember the frontier. Yeah. And they wanted and they could see that. I mean, part of that was just American culture and the frontier culture and all that sort of stuff. But to be able to think of that adventure in a time when adventure was it sounded like we were at the end of adventure. And that we kind of crossed that point where there was no longer a frontier and that sort of thing. But also, what a thumb in the nose of that. Yeah. They're still out there robbing trains and stuff. When we think that we've civilized the nation, that's an interesting story too. Absolutely had people's attention at the time, and has had people's attention since. Can't always make sense of why some outlaws are so well remembered, and others, they no one knows their name, even though they in some ways were more prolific or more crazy in whatever they were doing. But these two are quite famous, and part of the reasons they're quite famous at the time is just because that was this vision that there was still the Wild West out there. Even in a world where you have the World's Fair going on, yeah.
I think it's an interesting to think about and talk about how people who were I think objectively these were the bad guys. They were robbing, they were shooting. I don't
know, because you look how they've been portrayed in film. They're portrayed maybe even as Robin Hood sort of characters.
Yeah,
but,
right.
Yeah, you're right. Objectively,
it's amazing.
These were thieves. These are robbers. These were people who could be quite dangerous. I'm quite sure. Many of them many of the Wild Bunch and stuff like that ended up in dangerous shootouts and etc. A lot of them ended up on the end of a rope. Quite a few of them ended up in prison. Yeah. So these were outlaws. Yeah. But I think maybe even at the time there were some people who followed their adventures with some sort of relish, as if they were something of a hero. And by the time you got into the dime novel period, then it was easy to turn an outlaw into a hero.
And certainly, there's a reason why. Culturally and historically why that thing kind of came about, and you can certainly say that the outlaw was in many ways more, and you can even tell in the story where the ways that they're kind of forced into being criminals or the way that they're kind of encouraged to continue to be criminals. There's reasons. I think everyone could see the idea of these like robber barons that were running the trains and stuff like that. I think everyone could see, gosh, maybe it would be nice to tell some of these rich people, where to stick it, kind of thing.
Yeah, there was something funny about them robbing the train because you were stealing from the rich, at a time, and when there was a lot of bad publicity on the people in the railroad wars and stuff like that. So yeah, absolutely, you can see how they got some of that reputation too.
Because there's obviously, there's something extremely. There's something about these people that has kept people throughout history, even at the time, to being really attracted to the concept of this romanticized outlaw life.
Yeah, and it doesn't hurt. They were two handsome men and a beautiful woman. I mean, even by modern standards, if you looked at them, and I think that probably, I mean, these guys look like movie stars.
Yeah, they absolutely did, right? And that's in the handful of pictures that we have. I mean, certainly you can imagine them playing themselves in shootouts and stuff like that in the classic Western. I mean,
Paul Newman and Robert Redford, play them was not that far off of
no, not really,
like movie
right?
stars,
Yeah, that, and it's just amazing how all that kind of comes together to, because I think we also want to think that generally people who are really bad are we've always wanted to connect that to they also look evil in some way, and these guys didn't necessarily look evil.
They didn't look like the Black Cats.
Yeah,
they actually more often wore derbies. These two,
yeah.
But
one of the things that these photos that we have of them, which are so incredible, kind of mark some of that change in technology and this loss of the frontier, because before the photos, it was much harder to identify them for certain, and then they get this photo taken, and suddenly everyone in the country has got a very clear picture of who these guys are, and that was a significant change.
Yeah, it was probably a mistake all around. The picture taken. Certainly, the one in San Antonio was a mistake. That ended up getting a lot of them in a lot of trouble. Yeah,
but it was as a photograph. It is incredible that is a historical
and it's quite it's a clear, straight up, beautiful photograph of the whole bunch.
Yeah, no, it's and
to think of a good, certainly not the whole wild bunch, but of a good good
chunk of them. Yeah, and it's a group that we otherwise might not have had any image of, and so we've got this extremely good image from clearly what was a lapse in judgment.
And it appears you could just walk into a photo studio and have a nice picture taken, and who was thinking that our picture would be so nice that they put us up in the window there,
and that would lead to the Pinkertons using it to make copies and send it all over the place. And that was a change too in terms of how technology was working to fight things like crime, and how the Pinkertons were using it to catch people. And it was an interesting way on how that kind of worked together. I did want to mention very briefly, because it's not really related, but there's a video game I played called Red Dead Redemption that is clearly heavily influenced by this concept. If you've played, especially the second one, you really get this idea of how they're getting pressed by the Pinkertons the whole time. They're moving from place to place. They're just trying to get one big score so that they can go live like some commune life, and how that kind of that whole way of life and this idea of this like freedom they wanted kind of is collapsing.
As it becomes more modern too, but certainly that's part of their story that they talked about many times, is that they wanted to go straight. They said just this score, and I would go straight, and then somehow the law was going to catch up with them, and they just never could. The ones that had gone that direction just never found a way back.
And so it's it's amazing the ways that this story has clearly continued to inspire people, and to the point where how could Butch Cassidy have imagined that his story and his life would be portrayed in a video game? That's something that he never could have understood, and it's amazing that still kind of connects and resonates with us today. So if you are a listener or watcher of The History Guy and you want to support what we do and keep us doing what we do, one of the best ways you can do that is you can go to Patreon, and for a couple of bucks a month, you get some more access to The History Guy. You get some chances at some kind of stuff we do. We do some bow ties. We have some challenge coins that you get if you are at particular levels.
It's a very good way for you to support Forgotten History, to help us keep this operation going. So if you enjoy these, if you enjoy the podcast, it's hard to make money out of a podcast.
Yeah.
It's surprisingly hard to make money out of a podcast. We love this, and we think that other people love it too. And if you think that's worth a couple of dollars a month, that can really make a big difference to us. It's patreon.com/thehistoryguy, and you'll find us there. And it's just a good way to support continuing to preserve this forgotten history.
Now for the final part of Butch Cassidy's story.
In February of 1901, two of America's most famous outlaws and a companion left the United States under assumed names, heading for Argentina. There they hoped to start a new life and escape their criminal past, and for a while they would find success. But ultimately they would not find escape. They would return to their life of crime, and they would leave behind some of history's most enduring mysteries. The final chapters in the life of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid are history that deserves to be remembered. The three Americans arrived by steamer in Buenos Aires, March 23, 1901. The man traveling under the name Jim Ryan had been born Robert Leroy Parker, but had become known under the name Butch Cassidy, purported leader of the notorious gang of Wild West bank and train robbers called the Wild Bunch. With him was a couple going by the name Mr. and Mrs. Harry A. Place. Harry had been born Harold Alonzo Longabaugh, but had ridden under the nickname the Sundance Kid. The two were friends, but it was not clear how close or even when they first met. What was known was that they had committed a bank robbery in Winnemucca, Nevada in August of 1900, their last big heist, and had decided to travel to South America to escape the pursuit of the notorious detectives of the Pinkerton Agency. The woman, calling herself Mrs. Harry Place, was named Ethel, although she had been popularly called Etta. Little is known about her, even her real name, aside from the fact that she and Harry had met sometime around 1899, while he was laying low after the Winnemucca heist, and he had told his family that they were married in 1900. In November 1900, Butch and Sundance had met up with other members of their gang in Fort Worth, Texas, where they had their photo taken. A Pinkerton agent had seen the photo in the shop and contacted law enforcement. The group fled when one of them recognized a lawman on the streets. Harry collected Ethel, a woman he told a friend he had previously met in Texas. The two claimed to marry, although no official record has been found, visited his family in Pennsylvania, and traveled to New York, where Butch joined them. The three then caught the steamer to Buenos Aires. In Argentina, they bought a ranch in a remote area, which was successful and made many friends, both locals and other American expatriates. Harry and Ethel made a trip back to the United States in 1902, visiting relatives and Coney Island. They visited again in 1904, spending time in the Fort Worth area and then attending the St. Louis World's Fair. The Pinkertons were still chasing them, but were always a step behind. The agency had bribed people to intercept the outlaws' mail and figured out that they were in Argentina from letters Butch sent to his sister. But they didn't pursue them at the time, as their employers did not authorize funds to chase them that far. In February 1904, there was a bank robbery in Argentina by what was described as two gringos. Butch and Sundance have often been blamed for the robbery, although it was very likely committed by another pair of Americans, as Butch and Harry seem to be still living law-abiding lives on their ranch. The robbery, however, brought new attention to the outlaws. The Pinkertons convinced Argentina to issue an arrest warrant in April of 1905. Friends warned them before the warrant could be served, and they were on the run again. In December 1905, the Banco de la Nación in Villa Mercedes de San Luis, Argentina, was robbed. Witnesses reported that the robbers were three men and a woman. Butch, Sundance, and Ethel were identified as three of the robbers by witnesses from their wanted posters. The third man is a question. Local newspapers at the time suggested that the man was Harvey Logan, known as Kid Curry, a member of Butch and Sundance's Wild Bunch gang. Logan had supposedly been killed by a posse in 1904, but there were questions about his identity, and famed Pinkerton detective Charlie Siringo was convinced they'd gotten the wrong man. Did Kid Curry escape death and, like Butch and Sundance, make it to South America for another life? Or was the third man someone else, a local that was picked up for the job? Or might the job have actually been carried out by another gang altogether? We do know that witnesses said that one of the robbers, quite possibly the female, was wounded during the getaway. Ethel then mysteriously disappeared from the picture, and Butch and Harry took legitimate jobs. Harry started becoming more loose-lipped about their past, and that is when he presumably provided the details to locals about the bank robbery that he and Cassidy had pulled in Winnemucca in 1900. The robbery was their last big score, and apparently the one that convinced them that it was time to leave the United States. Those details were later published. Although the two took legitimate jobs, every once in a while they would simply disappear for a time, just like they'd done in the United States. Of course, the assumption is that during those periods, they were committing crimes. In November 1908, two Yankees robbed a mine payroll in Bolivia. The robbers apparently assumed that the people robbed would not be able to pass word quickly in the remote area. But the victims of the robbery happened upon another traveler and were able to spread a warning to nearby towns. The two Yankees sought lodging in a house in a small village of San Vicente, Bolivia. The locals, however, suspected that they were the men who had robbed the mine payroll. They alerted a nearby military patrol, 3 cavalrymen, and a police inspector. 3 of the men from the patrol surrounded the house. The Yankees fired at them, and one of the soldiers was hit in the throat and killed. The group returned fire, and after a brief gunfight, 3 loud shouts were heard from the house, followed by 2 gunshots. In the morning, the bodies of the outlaws were found. One, assumed to be the Sundance Kid, had been hit several times in the arm and then shot in the forehead. The second, assumed to have been Butch Cassidy, had a shot to the temple. Authorities surmised that Butch had shot his mortally wounded friend and then killed himself to avoid capture. There is compelling circumstantial evidence that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid died that day. The two men that were killed were most definitely the robbers. The money from the payroll robbery was found in their saddlebags. The general descriptions of the two men fit descriptions of Butch and Harry, although they lacked the sort of specifics that you could use for a positive identification. The time frame makes sense, and the way that the robbery was conducted makes sense. There's no definitive evidence that Butch or Harry were somewhere else at the time. Certainly many of their friends and family, both in South America and North America, were convinced that they died that day. And letters from Harry Longabaugh to his family stopped after that day. And letters that were written to Butch Cassidy's pseudonym at the time, Frank Boyd, likewise went unanswered. By far, the most accepted theory to historians was that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were killed in 1908 in Bolivia. But there are legitimate reasons for skepticism. The men were buried as desconocidos, unknowns. The bodies were never viewed or identified by anyone who positively knew them. The remains have never since been discovered. An attempt by archaeologists to locate the remains in 1991 failed to find any remains that matched DNA of relatives of Butch or Harry. The cemetery is crowded. It's possible their remains are simply lost among the graves or interred outside the cemetery, but so far, no remains that can be definitively proved to be those of Robert Parker and Harry Longabaugh have ever been identified. Bolivia, who buried them as unknowns, never provided death certificates in their names. More intriguingly, if two unknown Yankees had been killed after a payroll robbery in Bolivia, Butch and Harry had every reason to let the world believe that it was them. The two had tried to go straight many times, only to have the law track them down. They'd been accused of many crimes that they probably didn't commit, and this last one might have offered them an opportunity for freedom. The lack of proof has resulted in many theories, some mere speculation, but some that cannot be easily discounted. Many members of Butch Cassidy's family insisted that he returned to the United States, reconnected with his family, and lived possibly into the 1940s. Family members and acquaintances have gone on record with positive identifications of Robert Parker, aka Butch Cassidy, 15 years after he was supposed to have died. Several went on camera in a 1978 episode of the TV program In Search Of. These were not just sightings in a crowd, but people claiming to have spent substantial time and had lengthy conversations with a man they claimed could only have been the Butch Cassidy that they knew. One of those making that claim was Josie Bassett. The daughter of a Utah rancher, Bassett had grown up in the area called Outlaws Trail that was a place of hideout for members of the Wild Bunch. She was very familiar with Butch Cassidy, having first met him when she was a teenager while he was working at a nearby ranch and using the name George Cassidy. In a 1960 interview, she recalled of him, "I thought he was the most dashing and handsome man that I had ever seen. I was such a young thing and giddy as most teenagers are, and I looked upon Butch as my knight in shining armor." By her own admission, the two were linked romantically, or as she described it, "All I can say is, I didn't let him get bored." In the interview, she matter-of-factly stated, "I saw Butch Cassidy back in the 1920s after he came back from South America." The meeting occurred in Rock Springs, Wyoming. She said that he was with Elsie Lay, who had been Butch's best friend and a member of the Wild Bunch. Lay had been arrested in New Mexico in 1899 and sentenced to prison, and thus had missed Butch's last successful robberies and his escape to South America. He had received a pardon in 1906. She described them having a long conversation, three friends catching up. She said Butch described his life in South America, and after, she concluded, Butch died in Johnny, Nevada, about 15 years ago. Butch's family, however, has refused to disclose the location of his final burial, saying that he had been chased all his life and they would not let him keep being chased after he died. An attempt by modern researchers to recover his remains from a potential burial site in 2017 produced some remains, but they were not a DNA match. So far, no remains in the United States have been discovered that can be definitively identified as Butch Cassidy, or provide proof that he survived after he was supposed to have been killed in Bolivia in 1908. That, of course, leaves the question of what had happened to Harry Longabaugh, the Sundance Kid. One story suggested that Butch had actually escaped in the night after Longabaugh had been killed by the posse, but another story says that the two that were killed in Bolivia were two entirely different men, and that Butch and Harry had spread the rumor that it was them so that they could escape the law. Like Butch Cassidy, there were many rumors about Harry Longabaugh returning to the United States. One of the most intriguing was a rancher named William Henry Long, who died in Utah in 1936. Long's age was correct for Harry Longabaugh, and he bore what was called a striking resemblance to the famous outlaw. What's more, he told his family that he was the Sundance Kid, and they believed it to be true. In 2009, Long's remains were exhumed from a cemetery in Duchesne, Utah, and tested versus the DNA of a person believed to be a distant relative of Harry Longabaugh. The results were unable to prove that the two were connected. But there was an issue. Groundwater in the cemetery had disintegrated the coffin, and it's very likely that the remains that they found had been contaminated. The DNA results were, in fact, inconclusive. And once again, there is simply no evidence in Bolivia or the United States that can be definitively tied to the remains of Harry Alonzo Longabaugh. And that leaves a final question. What happened to Longabaugh's companion, Etta Place? The answer is elusive. We don't even know her real name. We have no reliable information on her life before she met Harry Longabaugh in Texas in 1899. The Pinkertons kept files on her and searched for more information in Texas, but their results are contradictory and much of it is speculative. In fact, she always used the name Ethel. The name Etta was apparently simply the Pinkertons' mistake, either from a misspelling in a report or because Spanish speakers in Argentina had difficulty pronouncing her name. It's not clear when she was last seen. If witnesses to the 1905 bank robbery were correct, she was last seen escaping that robbery. In July 1909, a woman met the U.S. consul in Argentina, seeking help finding a death certificate for Harry Longabaugh, presumably to settle his estate. Officials in Bolivia were unable to help, only producing death certificates for the two desconocidos. The woman was described as pretty, but her name was not recorded, and it's not clear whether the woman was Ethel. In the speculation for her true identity, there were a couple of clear-eyed contenders. One of the theories was that she was a woman named Eunice Gray, who owned a brothel and ran businesses in Fort Worth, Texas, and passed away in 1962. Their reported ages were similar. Eunice Gray was described very much like Etta Place, as pretty, intelligent, and well-spoken, and reportedly had a similar appearance. Miss Gray had once mentioned to a newspaper that she'd spent time in South America during roughly the period when Etta Place was known to be there. However, when relatives were found who had pictures of Eunice Gray, and the pictures were compared to the known picture of Etta Place and Harry, it was clear they were not the same person. Another contender was Ann Bassett, Josie's younger sister. Ann herself was a famous pioneer and a rancher and possibly a rustler who was called Colorado's Cattle Queen. While Ann later said that she barely knew Butch Cassidy, other sources linked her romantically to Butch and other members of the Wild Bunch. The speculation is that she had taken up with Harry and traveled with them to South America. The most compelling evidence was that the two were strikingly similar in appearance. So much so that a group at the Los Alamos Natural Laboratory that specialized in photographic comparisons determined them to be the same person. However, there are periods when Ethel was seen by witnesses in Argentina, while Ann was clearly in the United States, including being arrested and incarcerated on accusations of cattle rustling. The timelines simply do not align. Without even knowing who she was, we are left with speculation as to what happened to her. One possibility is that she did participate in the robbery in 1905 and was the person wounded, and it's possible that she died then. Harry had told a friend from Argentina that she had relocated to San Francisco in 1906, and if so, it's not known what name she may have used, and there's no definitive record. If she'd gone to San Francisco, then she could have been one of the more than 3,000 people killed in the earthquake and fire in April. There have been many claims about her living in various parts of the United States or moving back to South America, but they amount to nothing more than speculation. Like her famous outlaw companions, we cannot identify her final resting place. We do know quite a few details about their life in Patagonia, but there are details that are simply fuzzy and some other details contradict. But what's most distressing is that even with all of the efforts of modern science, our methods still have yet to be able to find definitively what happened to these very famous people just at the turn of the last century. And that, of course, is distressing for people who study history, as we try to make speculation about things that happened millennia before that. But still, the inability to know exactly what happened to Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and Etta Place reminds us how much history there is still to discover. History that deserves to be remembered.
Now, as amazing and legendary as the first part of the story is, the second part is so shrouded in things like legend and
Absolutely,
mystery and conspiracy. I mean, you can't.
Yeah,
There are more.
It's so much fun just because it's such a good mystery.
Yeah.
And there's a reason to keep considering this mystery. And they're not the only, Wild West sort of outlaws that we don't know what happened to them. But for most of them, we actually do know what happened to them in the end. But here we have these two famous outlaws. They hop on that boat. And it's after that, we don't know for sure where they finally wind up. And it's amazing. I mean, there's a lot that's interesting to it. The Pinkertons knew where they went, and they knew where they were probably the whole time. But the people that were paying the Pinkertons didn't want to pay them to go all the way to Patagonia to pick them up. But there's just this point where they just sort of, they disappear, and it's not quite clear if these robberies that are going on is them. Yeah. And so it's really kind of it's a fascinating bit of history. And it really does, it gives you an insight into what their life kind of must have been like down there. Yeah. But on the other hand, and again, as we cross between the modern and the old Wild West. I mean, you head to Bolivia, and then you got some more of the Wild West down there, and it's really kind of it's a fascinating life. But it ends with such an interesting mystery. Yeah. And one of the things that was very interesting about this episode is the number of people who commented who are absolutely sure that they know where Butch or Sundance or Etta Place is. I've had people saying, like, my grandmother knew Etta Place. And it's funny because, researchers have been trying to answer those forever. But I don't know how many people in the country are quite sure that they know, the ending of that is still to historians an ending that is still a mystery. And a lot of those stories are contradictory. So, I mean, I don't know who knows what. But.
Yeah, right. And I don't know. You don't know if those are just legends that grew up, or if somebody just told a story and it's ended up. Or honestly, I mean, some of them might be true.
Absolutely might be true. Yeah.
That's one of the interesting things about this, and one of the really interesting pieces that we're able to talk about here is that we're not 100% sure that they died.
That's what makes it so fun. The circumstantial evidence that they died in Bolivia is powerful. Yes. The anecdotal evidence that they were back in the United States after that is also powerful.
Yeah.
And we have never found remains that we can tie to either of them. And that is a fascinating story. And, Etta Place, she just disappears. She's with them one day. She's not with them. We don't know we never know what her name was. So if she came back to the U.S., she literally could have just dropped it all, gone back to whatever her name was, and no one would have known.
And she might have. I mean, quite honestly, for all we know, she did decide she didn't. She could have died at that robbery.
She could have died in the San Francisco earthquake, or she could have died in a robbery, or she could have been the beautiful woman that came back and never gave her name that was trying to seek to close Butch Cassidy's estate. We just honestly don't know.
We don't know.
And so it's fascinating to have people that were world famous at the time, and have remained world famous since. And we cannot agree on what happened to them, and we cannot find proof. I mean, they're still searching every day, cannot find proof to answer that, to confirm any of these many different theories about where they went.
Well, and of course, with Etta, I mean, gosh, even if we did find her body, we don't really have any way of identifying it.
I mean, her it's quite possible that she's laying in a grave under her name, under a headstone, in a place. I mean, a million people could have walked by that grave because we don't know what her real name was. I mean, with Etta, we know her name was not Etta. That came either from a Pinkerton misspelling, or it might have come from people in South America who couldn't pronounce Ethel. But I mean, she's still well known as Etta Place, even though. But we don't know that either of those are her names, and we do know from the theories about who she was that the main theories about who Etta Place was have been disproven.
Yes.
And that's the main ideas about this is who Etta Place was. We know she wasn't Bassett because we know she was in South America when Bassett was in jail.
Yeah.
And so the couple of places where people thought she came from, we've been able to verify it's not her. And so honestly, no idea, And so it's just fascinating that someone could be so important in history. And I don't know that someone who writes and says my grandmother knew, maybe she maybe told all of her friends and no one ever wrote that down. Or maybe she died, at a stream in South America, having been shot and getting in a robbery. We just honestly, we never know. She might be under a gravestone in South America somewhere too.
I mean, that's true of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid too. Is that ultimately maybe they're in that cemetery? We don't have any proof that they are.
If they're buried in the United States, no one has ever pointed out a grave in a place where we could exhume the remains and successfully recover DNA in order to prove that it's them.
Yeah. So there's a legitimate possibility that we have actually found their bodies and we just weren't able to prove it.
There is. There certainly was. There were remains of a Hank Long. That certainly sounds like, if there was a Harry Longabaugh, that's the name he might have used.
Yeah.
And those remains could be recovered, and they had been contaminated by groundwater, and so we couldn't match it. There are claims that Butch was buried here in the United States, but they didn't want to say where. And so again, we've never. But they're in Bolivia. They matched the general descriptions, but no one that personally knew them ever identified the corpses.
No.
And in this little cemetery, if you ever see a picture of the cemetery, I mean, they've clearly been burying people on top of each other for a long time. They've never been able to discreetly figure out which graves belong to the two gringos, so that we could test to see if they were or won't. And several expeditions have gone there and never successfully found even the remains of the people that were killed that day. More or less been able to prove that was Butch Cassidy or the Sundance Kid. Yeah.
And we already had so much evidence of them being attached to crimes they didn't commit.
Yes. I mean, that included in the United States, and that probably occurred in South America. Yeah. Probably in South America, anytime that you had two gringos down there that were robbing banks, which, I mean, I think a lot of outlaws escaped down there, then they would blame it on Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. So, it wouldn't be... Now, it would be quite clever of them. They'd always wanted to go straight. It would be quite clever of them to have seen in the newspaper that two white dudes were killed up in the mountains, and to suddenly stop sending letters, suddenly stop answering letters, not go back to jobs that they had previously under different names. It stretches credulity some, but it also stretches credulity that people who personally knew them quite well are saying, I've sat down and had an hour-long conversation, and I tell you that was Butch Cassidy. It could have been anybody else.
And, there's some reason why they might have, they had tried to move to South America to get away from things. Mm-hmm. And they sent those letters, and they found out that those letters were probably whether they knew for sure that the Pinkertons were reading them or not, they for sure knew that they were still tracked down. And so maybe they decide, we're not going to do that. It's just not worth the risk. There's no way for us to...
Yeah, it had to be... I mean, they had to have been thinking that through and saying if there's if there's a point... Because if it can come so that, Harry would stop, writing letters so that they would stop responding. Butch would stop responding to letters under his pseudonym and stuff like that. I mean, it would have been quite clever, but I mean, it's not outside, the bounds of reality. So, again, there's compelling evidence both directions, and they're both quite plausible stories. And we still have a better idea on those two than we have on Etta Place. We don't even know when she disappears. We don't know when she leaves them.
Or not even 100% sure if that robbery that they were supposedly at was them.
Yeah. Oh, we don't. Yeah, the robbery where someone was injured, that might have been. That's one of the theories. It might have been her. And if it is, they haven't found out where they buried her. Nope. But that might not have been any of them.
They might not have been involved.
Well, one of the arguments is that their friend was Kid Curry, and theoretically, Kid Curry had been killed in the United States. And so, if you could shoot a dude and misidentify him, and him make it all the way to Bolivia, then you could totally be wrong on who committed the robbery. So it's funny because these guys are so well known that there's so much we know about them, but so much of what we know about them might not be real, and it makes the legend so very much fun. And as a historian, all I could do, I was trying to do in these episodes is say this is what we know and what we don't know, and what the ideas might be. But there's an awful lot of people that are happy to write a book saying they know what happened.
Absolutely. Well, fairly recently we were seeing somebody who had commented on the video talking about a particular story, and we went and found newspaper articles from this guy in the 70s in Montana who claimed to be I think Sundance's son, and he claims that Sundance came back and that he's buried actually where I live here in Casper, but he doesn't know what name he would have been buried under or anything. And that's a I don't know, it's halfway as believable as so many other different things. Was he? Did he come back to the U.S.? Did he live his life as a normal guy and have this son? And the son has stories in the newspaper. It's really hard to tell if they're any more believable than any other story we've heard, but it is interesting. So there's an absolute possibility that that I'm living in a town where the Sundance Kid has been buried here the whole time, and we just have no idea who he is.
Yeah, it's true. You're in Casper, Wyoming. There is every reason to think he might be right there.
Yeah, that guy certainly believed it, or he seems to be very earnest in the stories he was telling in the newspapers. But I don't know. I mean, was he making that up because then he got to be in the
There were reasons to doubt the story, but there are reasons that the story could be true. I don't know. Like Hank Long. I mean, there's maybe he was just telling stories. People say, you look like the Sundance, or you look like Harry Longabaugh, the Sundance Kid. And he's like, oh, sure I was.
Right? I don't know.
So I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm not trying to say it isn't. I'm saying that we don't know. And if the thing that would settle the issue would be for us to identify a grave and say, that is where so-and-so died, and us be able to test it and say that had to have been the Sundance Kid. Yeah. We have the ability to do that. We just have never found the bodies.
Yeah.
So we could certainly clarify straight up, whether the people that were killed in Bolivia were Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, or close relatives of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. We can't find them.
Yeah.
We can't find the bodies. And here, the claims that the bodies, if we found Harry Longabaugh's body, the remains were contaminated so that we can't identify, and we haven't been able to find the grave. There's supposedly Butch Cassidy's grave, and so but we have people anecdotally saying that they saw him, and it's really a fascinating story. It's a fun story to tell. And telling the whole arc of their lives from the foundation all the way to the great mystery at the end. And it becomes forgotten history because so much of their story is forgotten or unknown. But it does take it to two very famous people to say how, when they're that famous, when they're crossing over into the modern era, can we be left with so many question marks? And that's part of the fun of being a historian, I tell you what.
Yeah, we've got an excellent photograph of these guys, and we are not sure when or where they died, or even under what name they might be buried.
For most of their life, there's question marks. We only know who they were when they got in a boat, and from there both directions, there's all sorts of question marks.
And that's what makes, I think that's part of what makes history so interesting to talk about, because this is a story that is as good as anything you'll hear in fiction.
And it was a very fun story to tell. I love my job, and this is one of the reasons.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten History, and if you did, you can find more on our website, thehistoryguy.com. We release podcasts every 2 weeks, so stick around if you want to hear more podcasts of Forgotten History. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. You can even get a personalized message from the History Guy himself on Cameo.